Hi, Tiffany, and welcome to the Calm and Courageous podcast. It's a parent's guide to powerful allyship in raising children with disabilities. Tiffany, I was, researching you. I've been reading your book, and I'm going to tell our viewers Tiffany Yu is an American entrepreneur and a disability rights advocate who founded Diversability, which is a social enterprise to advocate for equality for people with disabilities. Is there anything else you want to add to that? Am I forgetting anything?
I'm also the author of this book, The Anti Ableist Manifesto. It came out last October, but essentially feels more relevant now than ever, and hopefully can be a good starting point for people who want to show up better for the disability community.
I think that's spot on. It does feel so relevant right now. And I told you a little bit about me when I emailed you and asked you to be on the podcast. I grew up with primary lymphedema, which affects my life. It's one of those disabilities, and we'll get into it because as I'm reading your book, you talk about there are disabilities that can seem hidden to the outside world. And with lymphedema, it can affect different parts of your body. For me, it just so happens to affect my lower limbs. And so if I'm wearing pants or a long skirt, you may not know, but in my everyday life, it causes, daily pain, brain fog, a myriad of things. But when I had my second born, who was born in 2018, was born with hearing loss. And then 2 years later, my daughter was also born with hearing loss. And I remember at the time, having so many conflicting feelings around disability. Growing up in the church and the Christian faith, there's a lot of laying on hands and healing ministries. And I just remember, having this association with disability as somehow I had failed. I remember thinking, did I eat something wrong? Was I exposed to something? We know now it's something some type of genetic mutation, something that may have been passed down from a relative that we're unaware of. But I say that to say, I remember at one point thinking, although I had kind of lived with this shame around my disability, I didn't want that for my kids. And I felt like, you know what? This is how they were born. And I started learning a lot more about the deaf culture and the deaf community because I wanted them to have a sense of pride. And knowledge is power. And the more I learned about it, the more I felt equipped to support them and to be an ally. Fast forward back to your book, I started researching about 2 years ago disability pride. I just so happened to stumble across someone online talking about disability pride. And I was like, never even thought to put those two words together. And so I started celebrating it with my family. I would have people come over and I would make like these little flags that I bought on Amazon. I ordered art, disability pride art. And then I started posting about it. I only have a handful of followers on social media, but I wanted that my community, my friends and family to know about it. And so I started telling them about the history and the ADA. And this year, during Disability Pride Month that just passed, I Googled reels on ableism because I wanted a quick thing that someone would be scrolling and say, oh, because we are all ableist. It's just this, we're conditioned to be this way. It's not even your fault. You were just this a conditioning. Even if you're living with a disability yourself, you have to push through all of that. And that's when I came across your reel and I shared it. And then you responded, thanks for amplifying this. And I was so excited. I was like, I told my husband, I'm like, Ayende, his name's Ayende. Ayende, she said, thanks for amplifying this. Do you think she'd do the podcast? She has a book, she does tech talks. I don't think. And he was like, just ask. Maybe she will. So thank you. And I said all of that to say the book is so incredibly relevant at a time where, it feels like we're going backwards in time. And but we do have people who are wanting to be more aware and wanting to make an impact. And so thank you for writing this book because it's now going to be one of those books that I reference that I have.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Did you want to share anything? I just said a lot because I was excited.
Yeah, I think there's a lot. I think there's a lot to unpack there. The first is I think many of us grew up with what's known as the moral model of disability, right? This moral failing, or maybe somewhere in our ancestral lineage, there was, at least in my family's cultural background, everything is tied to your ancestral lineage, and so for a disability, it meant some failing or some bad luck or curse that happened in a past generation.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is unlearning. And so a lot of the work I do is what I call supporting disabled people on their shame to pride transformation,
Wow.
because we don't want our kids to grow up with that level of shame, right? But I actually think that so many of us are constantly unlearning that shame or unlearning that ableism. The other thing I'll share too, I love that you said knowledge is power. I also feel like community is power, right? So
Yeah,
it's knowledge in community that creates power. And part of how I think ableism as a system of oppression gets its power is by making us think we have none, right? So intentionally not providing us knowledge or community so that we can so that we don't know that we have that we're not alone in our experience. And I think part of, again, not only where ableism gets its power, but where shame gets its power is by making us feel isolated and alone, right? And so it's meeting other people like us, getting educated on how prevalent some of our disabilities are. Yes, there are rare diseases that exist too, but even there are rare disease communities as well. So,
absolutely.
so I'm a big fan of community. But also, and I shared this in the book, ableism as a term, the first time it was ever used was 1981.
Wow.
So up until the 1980s, and I was born in the 1980s, and I don't think I'm that old. Uh, but but all of that to say that we didn't even have the language to explain the type of oppression that we were experiencing until 40-ish years ago.
Yeah.
So that also shows me that it's okay that we're all still unlearning ableist beliefs, right? And still harboring a lot of ableism. We're seeing it now displayed very overtly in the current administration in federal actions that are happening. And it's also the overt, but there's also the ableist microaggressions and uh, the more subtle ableism, or what we call everyday ableism, that's also happening.
Yeah.
So I also will say the last lesson here is, I guess, to shoot your shot.
Yeah.
You just never know how receptive someone is. And I even remember going through the process of asking for endorsements on the book. And asking someone to endorse the book, it's a lot to ask them. You're asking them to read the book, and these are people who are probably already maybe overextended on their time. But I will say that I think part of the success of this book to me has been the ways that our community has been lifting it up.
Yeah.
So I feel more than willing to take some time out to chat with someone who is taking the time to want to learn, because I want to invest my energy in people who want to show up, because there are just as many people, not just as many, there are also the people who don't care and may never care until disability impacts them, which it will at some point in their lives. And so part of my hope is, are we able to get those people into our first and second degrees of connection or areas of influence to be able to reach them? And this is why I feel really hopeful about the power of social media to be able to reach the people that we may have never imagined we could have been able to reach before.
Absolutely. I think that the disability community and social media, you have this relationship because I have, young children and you worry, oh my gosh, they're going to be online and, it has so many negative effects, screen time. But I will say that social media has saved me in so many ways, like my mental health or been an escape or a sense of community. I guess you're so right. That community is power. When I can find another family who has a similar situation in life, whether they have children with hearing loss or children with a disability or meeting other women who are living with primary lymphedema, it has and then also having family members or friends see my posts and go, "Hey, I didn't know that. Tell me more." Oh,
Mm,
wow. Where can I come to an event? Or having friends and family, donate. I just did a walkathon in June. Was it June? Yeah, for the Walk for Hearing. And the Hearing Loss Association was able to raise $30,000 for people living with hearing loss.
wow.
And a lot of this is coming from donations from people who just like, I don't know how to be a part of it, but I just want to learn and be of support. And then also sort of recognizing their own ableism. It's funny because I would consider myself to be someone who is aware, or at least I would like to think of myself. But you're so many things, you're right. It's also new to us. This idea of ableism and this idea of being, you know, to view disability in a different way. And there's so many things that I want to talk about, but you mentioned saying things like, "That's so lame," or "Are you deaf?" Here, he's a vegetable. She's crazy, insane, psycho. These are things that I gosh, it's in my vocabulary that I wasn't aware of. I was after having my children. You know how many times I would say tone deaf?
Mm,
I said it all the time. Oh, that's so tone deaf. Oh, she's so tone deaf. And then I'm saying that like this person is I'm the one that was being insensitive or so unaware. Um, Paralyzed by fear. So many things that was in my vocabulary that I'm reading it and I go, "Oh my gosh, I have forgotten to take this out of my vocabulary." And now I'm aware of it. And what I was going to ask you, sometimes when you're with friends or family, what is your opinion on sort of educating someone when you hear them say these things?
mm. So the category that I would put this all into is what I call it the weaponization of disability terms.
Yeah.
But in more plain language, that is using disability terms figuratively and not literally.
Mm.
So what I tell people to do is, or two questions I usually will encourage people if they find themselves weaponizing these disability terms is, what were you really trying to say? And is there alternative language you can use instead?
Yeah.
And I didn't get to include this quote in the book, but I remember reading this Harvard Business Review article about common phrases that we use that, again, are using disability terms in a negative way. And the quote was, using ableist language doesn't make you a bad person, it makes you a person. But if you have the privilege to at least try, then why not try?
Yeah.
Right? So again, it's not saying it's not shaming you. So many of these have been ingrained into our society for a long time, especially the weaponization of mental illness.
Oh,
Right. And so as someone who lives with a mental illness, I actually have been more transparent around saying, "Hey, I'm mentally ill."
yeah.
Right? Because people have used that as an insult in a lot of different scenarios. When I also want to say, "Hey, I'm someone who lives with this," by you using it in a way for someone who doesn't have a mental illness, but using it as a way to put someone down, this is how it makes me feel. So I
Yeah.
guess in the context of the
Mm.
family, and I do include some examples in the book,
You do.
but I really like the phrase, "What makes you say that?" So that is if you are in conversation with someone and you want to interrupt, if you want to interrupt them right away, one alternative can be, and my partner actually called me out on it because I had corrected his language while we were in the middle of a conversation. He said, "Would it be okay if you wait until after I've made my point to do it?" Because I kind of interrupted him. So it's also kind of having that situational awareness to say, and there have been some instances where someone has said something to me using ableist language. I respond in the context of the conversation. Uh, whatever we were talking about. And then I say, "Oh, by the way, we don't really use that term anymore. Here's an alternative term you can use instead."
Yeah.
Right, right. So I also just want to make sure, and I think I include this in the book too, that yes, language is the starting point because language guides culture. But if we're talking about I don't know. I guess I'll use the language. I'll use a real example. There is an entrepreneur who has created tons of jobs at livable wages for the disability community. This person prefers to use a euphemism when talking about people who have disabilities. And at the same time, I actually feel like them creating jobs for disabled people. I believe over half of their staff are disabled people who, in other contexts, may not be able to get jobs or may be in sheltered workshops getting paid some minimum wage. I I I want to platform and amplify their work because it's really amazing, and I don't want to get lost in language in that case. And I have told that person that I prefer to use disability when talking about the disability community, and they prefer to use other language, right? And so at that particular point in time, I've said what I've needed to say. I'm not here to police everyone's language, especially if we're talking about more systemic issues that need to be addressed.
Yeah.
So I know I come back and I say, if any of your listeners are fans of improv, I'm a very yes and type of person.
Okay. Yeah.
So engage in the conversation, especially if you're talking about something that has the opportunity to have more systemic change. I call this part three of my book. Part one is kind of around language and things we need to know. Part three is really around how to change the systems overall. They
Yeah.
all integrate and operate in tandem with each other, but if language is where it starts and you feel like you have enough of a relationship with that person to say, hey, uh, especially, if you have kids who are living with are hard of hearing,
Yeah.
and you have a friend who is using terminology that might make your kids and you feel a certain way, then I think that they would be open enough to the feedback to want to adjust their language. And I will also share during Disability Pride Month, I had the opportunity to be a part of a panel of other disabled authors, and I actually saw them correcting their language in real time, right?
Wow.
And that was powerful, right?
Yeah.
Especially using the terms crazy and insane,
Yeah.
they would say, "Oh, that's wild," or "That's bizarre." There's so many, and this is the beautiful thing about language. And that's why I like to view this as a creative exercise rather than calling people out, is language is so beautiful and colorful, and we have so many ways to express ourselves. How can we view this as a creative exercise to say, what is alternative language that we can use instead to show the breadth and depth of how far our language can go?
Yeah. Oh, that's really powerful. And I love this idea of you kind of pick and choose what you're going to focus on. This entrepreneur who's creating these jobs, well, that's in this moment, we want to amplify this, that this is a great thing that this entrepreneur is doing, and we don't have to nitpick. And you're right, over time, we evolve and people grow and their language grows as they learn. And you're right, being in relationship with someone like my husband or a sister or a parent, it's gonna be a little bit more natural for me to say, hey, why did you choose to say it in this way? Oh, what about this? That is a lot more effective than a stranger or someone that I'm talking to in passing, right? And so you,
I think one other thing I wanted to add too is sometimes if I'm in conversation with someone and I notice they may be using outdated language, I will make sure I'm trying to model my language in a way, and then you'll notice a little bit of mirroring happening, or they'll pause and they'll say, "Oh, I'm noticing you're using this language," right? Because I will also acknowledge sometimes a why question can make people feel defensive as well. So that's why I like the question like, "What makes you say that?"
makes
Or
you say, oh,
um, or I just love those two questions that are, uh, you know, what are you really trying to say to
that's what it is. What are you
what are
trying,
you really trying to say? And then is
or what
there
did you say?
other alternative language you can use instead? But
That's
but you can determine what your questions are. I provided those scripts because I felt like when I was on social media, in the beginning of when I was starting my series around ableist language, I'd be like, don't say this," and I'd get a lot of comments from people saying, "Oh, well, you're telling me everything I shouldn't say, but you're not providing me with alternatives instead." So that's why for me, if I ever do decide to call someone in or call someone out, I will say, uh, I will acknowledge the language that they use, but then I will also try to provide them with alternative language to use instead. And I do put an asterisk both in the book and in this conversation here that what I'm providing you is a suggestion of a script. If that doesn't work with you, then adjust it to whatever feels more natural to you.
I think that's fantastic. And because really, like you say, it's about building community and it's about learning and creating a more accessible and anti-ableist society. So I just love all of this. You also talk about intersectionality. And this is something that I think about so often. And you talked about your experiences, and you sort of went through a lot of different backgrounds, people living with disabilities in this chapter. And me being a Black woman raising two children who are deaf and hard of hearing, I think about this particularly with my son. He is 6 now, but he's always been in the 99 percentile, and he's huge. He's bigger. He's almost bigger than his older brother, who's 9. But you know, the you still sometimes I lay awake at night thinking, oh my gosh, if he's ever pulled over by a cop and he can't hear them, and he not only is he big, he is one of the things we're working on with him is how he responds to being upset. He is one of the sweetest, he's probably the sweetest out of all of the kids, but he just has big emotion. And so he might have a big reaction to something of being upset. He hasn't developed that skill to regulate his emotions. Of course, he's 6. But I think I sometimes can be so afraid of what that looks like. He's gonna be 6 foot and up. He's gonna be huge. He's big. And then you write you know, more than half of disabled Black people in the United States will be arrested by the time they reach their late 20s, a horrifyingly high number that is double the 28% rate of white people with disabilities. You know, that, and that so many people who are in prisons or in the system have some sort of disability or cognitive disability or mental health. And I think about this a lot. So this little part of intersectionality, I just like, if there's no other reason other than to educate people, it's to save lives, right? Even if it makes us a little uncomfortable to learn.
Yeah, and I will say, I feel grateful I had an opportunity to write this book as an Asian disabled woman because I want to hear more of our intersectional stories, right? And and I was gonna say my hope is that that intersectionality is infused in more than just that one chapter that's on intersectionality, but it also just goes to highlight, I mean, I remember having a conversation with my friend who was a Black man, and we both lived in San Francisco at the time, and we talked about the differences in what it's like for me as an Asian woman to walk down the sidewalk, especially in a time where there was increased incidences of anti-Asian
Yeah.
racism,
Yes.
and his experience and the way he had to in some ways like water down who he was because of how he may be perceived, right? And I think that's some of what you're thinking about as your son gets older. And in some ways, my takeaway from the stat that you just read is how can we train our law enforcement to be more compassionate and understanding around disability,
Yeah.
right? And part of this is I think just an unlearning of compounded oppression that is happening all the time.
Yeah.
And this is why disability justice, I talk a little bit about disability justice
Yeah.
throughout the book, is it takes into account the ways that intersectionality plays a role because previously through a disability rights framework, you were white or didn't have as many minoritized identities that you could take legal action. Where if you were someone of color who maybe has a different relationship with the legal system, you may not feel like you have those rights in the same way that someone who was white or who had other identities may be able to take, right? And so it's just understanding that, and then and you've shared this a little bit too, but for me, as the daughter of Asian immigrants, disability, especially physical disability, were hidden away. We were not even seen in public
Yeah.
in certain East Asian countries. And if you did happen to have a disability, not only did you not tell anyone about it, it also meant that you didn't get the support that you needed, right? So I love this idea, kind of circling back to what you said around disability pride and your own journey of celebrating that, not only with yourself and your family, but to me, part of disability pride is the liberation of not only this aspect of our identity, but also getting the support that we need,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
and I come back to, we were talking about language. I talk about the weaponization of mental illness and the number of people who may be living with mental illness who, because it's so stigmatized, might not be getting the support that they need.
Yeah.
And across, I guess I'll call it the disability diaspora, I will say this is an area that is still misunderstood, right? And it took me over 20 years to be diagnosed with PTSD, and it I'm so grateful to better understand the way that my mind works, but it took a really long time to get there. And I think about future generations or younger Tiffany, and I wish she didn't have so much lack of clarity around what was going on with her neurodivergence at the time.
Yeah. 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 It's funny you say this. And I guess I won't, I have a family member who struggles with being bipolar or, right, struggle.
Lives with.
Lives with. See, I caught
And
myself.
I will also acknowledge maybe some people are struggling with their
Yeah.
disabilities, right? This is where the yes and comes in.
Yeah.
I do know some people who are suffering, but I wouldn't say I'm suffering with PTSD because I have learned how to manage it. So I live with my PTSD.
Yeah. She lives with it. And recently, and I'm going to talk more about this. I would actually like to have her on the podcast. I won't share who, just out of respect, and privacy. But I remember having this conversation, and she talked about just, the shame around it. And when I look back over the years of in our life together, I think, man, this explains so much. And you talk about getting the support that you need when not just you, but if there's someone in your life who's dealing with mental health or living with mental health needs, you understand them so much better. You understand how to support them. You can ask them, what do you need at this moment? You can learn about it. You can read about it. You have tools to be a better family member, a better friend, a better partner. Um, when we take away that stigma around disability. One thing, and we don't have much time, we only have about five or six more minutes, but one of the things that you mentioned is, growing up with that shame. And I talked to you in the beginning about being Christian and sort of being in that movement of laying of hands, and everything that God created, He created it perfect. And not only good and perfect things come from God. And He did not want you, if God is a loving God, do you think God would want you to live with this? So let's lay hands, and we're going to ask God to take this away from you. The amount of times that I have had a group of Christians lay hands on me to take away my lymphedema, to or this pressure, like you should stand up at church and ask for prayer, to why didn't you ask for God to take it? Or I even had a friend tell me once, there isn't any lymphedema in heaven, so it shouldn't be here on earth, right? And not to pick on these people because they're operating out of what they've learned and their experiences, but all of that I'm always anticipating the moment when someone comes up to me and wants to lay hands on my kids and take away their hearing loss. And I'm always sort of preparing myself for saying, here are the things that you can do. Here are the actions that you can take to be a better ally. How are you voting? How are you showing up in your everyday life? This is what we need as a disabled community, not this, you call it, and you mentioned it earlier, the moral model of disability. Because what it does make you feel is I am bad. This thing needs to be taken away from me. What am I doing wrong? And that is not at all what I want for my children or any viewers who are in a religious space or in a culture that makes you feel like your disability should be hidden away or taken away.
Yeah, I guess I just have 2 points on that. One is a book recommendation, which is from someone named Dr. Amy Kenny, who is featured throughout the book, but she wrote
I
a book called My Body is Not a Prayer Request.
I have that book. That was one of the
Okay.
first. That was one of the. And when you mentioned her, I go, "Oh my gosh, Amy!" I have her quote. I wrote out that you put in there. Yeah, I have, and I follow her online. She has these funny little videos that she makes about things that people will say to her. Yes, I have that book highlighted. It's one of the first ones I read from someone who's a believer or a Christian, where she talks about this. And I remember thinking, all of this weight just came off of me.
Mm.
I didn't mean to interrupt you. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, so I wanted to mention that because which leads to my second point, which is to me, these religious institutions are actually the first community. And so ultimately, I I grew up in a non-religious environment. I did go to Georgetown, but I remember getting a pamphlet at student orientation that was like, going to Georgetown if you're not Catholic.
Yeah.
But it I think there are things we can learn and unlearn in all different environments. And one thing I'm learning from some of these faith-based communities is that they are the first community, right? And so many of us who didn't have access to that are now going off to create our own communities. But exactly like you said, I think perhaps for you as someone who is of faith, maybe Dr. Amy Kenny's book, or even just existing and now taking the knowledge you've learned from the Anti Ableist Manifesto and some of your other learnings and bringing that into that space as well. Because I would like to think that the higher power, I have a hard time believing that over 1 billion of us who are disabled globally are bad or broken or need to be fixed, right? I think that we are all just a part of this human experience, trying to figure out ways that we can feel like we belong and be in community with each other and have bodies and minds and skin colors that are all different and coexist all at the same time, right? And I also question, I mean, I mentioned this in chapter 1, is who, and this was more around dictionary definitions, but who was in the room when they wrote this text or delivered this sermon or came up with this foundational belief, and did any of them have connection to disability or were disabled themselves, and did they have shame or pride around those aspects of their identities? Because I wonder if that could have shifted how these, in my case, and how these dictionary definitions or whatever foundational beliefs you have, where they came from, right? And I think we are part of the cusp of this unlearning, of this learning and unlearning and growing together. Even just seeing language shifts in my lifetime, even seeing a book like the Anti Ableist Manifesto exist 10 years ago, I don't know,
No.
right? And I even talked to some of my friends who are prominent disability advocates in this space, and none of us used the language of ableism until probably 5 years ago.
Yeah. Yeah.
We knew we were being discriminated against, but it wasn't elevated in our consciousness to have language to explain it.
Right. Tiffany, thank you so much. That is the best way. I think you've given us so much to work with right now. You've given us a way to be in community with people who are disabled, other people who are disabled, but to also be in community with those who are not, and to help build their understanding. And I will be recommending this book to so many people, the Anti Ableist Manifesto. I even think I want to give a copy to my kids are starting school this year. And I think I want to give their teachers a copy of this book because it's to keep what are your views and your thoughts when you're interacting with students who have the disability? And I think I know it will make you a better teacher and a better leader when you have that knowledge in that community. We're gonna cut off in a minute, but I thank you so much. You have no idea how grateful I am for you to take this time to educate me and to educate our viewers. Thank you, Tiffany, for being on the
Thank
Calm
you.
and Courageous podcast.
Thank you so much.